Greetings again, and welcome to episode 1 of When Wounds Speak. I'm Dr. Caroline Kristo. In episode 0, I introduced the purpose of this series, which is to help us understand the invisible wounds that often speak through our behavior. And of course, in the prelude, I extended my warm invitation to this journey of healing. Today, we begin with one of the most important questions we can ask. When did the wound begin? Because before we can understand what someone does, we often need to understand what they experienced. Number one, we need to understand what that experience came to mean to them. And number three, what they learned to do in order to survive it. And today, I want to begin with a story. I would like to tell you the story of two people. Their names are Zenra and Arahaz. They are fictional characters, but their story reflects emotional patterns I have observed throughout years of listening to individuals, couples, and families. As you listen, do not ask yourself, who are they? Instead, ask yourself, which parts of their story sound like mine? Zenra grew up without her father. She did not fully understand why he was absent. She only understood that someone who was supposed to be present was not there. No one helped her make sense of the emptiness. So quietly and without realizing, she began making a promise to herself. I will never need anyone. She became very responsible. She became capable, strong, and certainly independent. She learned how to solve problems by herself. She also learned how to carry pain without asking for help. She learned how to survive by relying on herself. People admired her strength, but very few people understood that some of that strength may have begun as protection. Somewhere along the way, independence became survival. Arahaz also grew up without his father, but his experience developed into a different emotional story. He often felt unwanted, unchosen. He felt as though he had to earn his place in someone's life. Deep inside, he carried a question. Does anyone truly want me? So he made a silent promise of his own. If I ever feel unwanted again, I will leave before I am left. As an adult, he longed to feel chosen. He wanted closeness, to feel wanted, to feel needed. He wanted reassurance. He wanted to know that he mattered. But when he sensed rejection, even when rejection was not intended, his wound became activated. Instead of staying close enough to explore what was going on or what was happening, he protected himself through distance. He withdrew emotionally. Sometimes he walked away physically. Leaving felt safer than remaining in a place where he believed he was no longer wanted. Years later, Zenra and Arahaz met. They were drawn to each other. They fell in love, but neither of them fully understood the child still living inside the adult. Zenra had learned to protect herself by depending on no one. Arahaz had learned to protect himself by distancing himself whenever he felt unwanted. At first, their differences may have appeared manageable, but when conflict entered the relationship, their protective strategies became louder. The more uncertain Zenra felt, the more independent she became. The more independent she became, the more unwanted Arahaz felt. The more unwanted he felt, the more he distanced himself. And the more he distanced himself, the more Zenra believed she had to rely only on herself. They were caught in a vicious cycle. Each person's protection intensified the other's wound. Before long, they were no longer simply responding to each other. Their wounds were speaking very loudly. They were responding to wounds that had formed long before they ever met. What if the greatest conflict between Zenra and Arahaz was not simply the argument they were having? What if there was another conversation taking place beneath their words? Her behavior was saying, I cannot depend on you. His behavior was saying, you do not want or need me. Neither statement may have reflected the complete truth of the present relationship, but each statement reflected an emotional truth carried from the past. This question changed the way I understood relationships. It changed the way I understood behavior, and it changed the way I understood myself. Before we judge someone's behavior, we should wonder what their heart had to survive. That does not excuse harmful behavior, but it does invite us to understand it before we judge it. An emotional wound is not simply a painful memory, it is a lasting psychological injury. It may develop when an emotionally significant experience overwhelms a person's ability to understand or to process or integrate what happened. The original experience may end, but the beliefs, emotional reactions, and protective patterns may continue. This is what we saw in Zenra and Arahaz. Their father's absence occurred in childhood, but the meanings they carried from that absence continued speaking in adulthood. Not every painful experience becomes an emotional wound. People may experience similar events and carry them very differently. That difference does not mean one person is stronger and the other is weaker. The impact of an experience may be influenced by age, by temperament, by attachment history, previous experiences, things like culture, available support, and the meaning the person formed from the experience. The event matters, but the way the event is experienced, or interpreted, or processed, and carried also matters. Up to this point, we've explored the story of Zenra and Arahaz. We've seen how two people can enter the same relationship carrying very different emotional histories. Now, I would like to introduce the framework that emerged from years of listening to people's stories and asking one simple question: what happens between an experience and a person's behavior? This is what I call the Kristo Wound Framework. It is a conceptual framework that helps me and hopefully helps us all understand how emotionally significant experiences may influence the beliefs we develop, the ways we protect ourselves, and the behaviors that others eventually see. Let's walk through it together. The experience. Everything begins with an experience. An experience may be joyful, it may also be painful, and it may happen once or happen repeatedly. For Zenra, one significant experience was growing up without her father. For Arahaz, it was not only growing up without his father, but also repeatedly feeling unwanted and rejected. The experience is the event, but the event alone does not determine the wound. Meaning, this is the one most important parts of the framework. Two people can experience similar events and walk away with very different meanings. The experience is objective, the meaning is personal. Zenra's heart quietly concluded, I must learn to depend on myself. Arahaz's heart quietly concluded, maybe I'm just not wanted. The meaning we attach to an experience becomes the bridge between what happened and what begins happening inside of us. Next is the emotional wound. When emotionally significant experiences overwhelm our ability to process or our ability to understand or integrate them, an emotional wound may develop. The wound is not simply the event. The wound is the lasting psychological injury that continues influencing us long after the original experience has ended. Next, number 4, we have the core belief. So over time, wounds often give birth to beliefs. These beliefs become the stories we carry about ourselves, other people, and the world in general. Zenra may begin believing, I don't need anyone. Arahaz may begin believing, if I'm not wanted, if I'm not needed, I should leave. Notice something important here. People rarely wake up and choose these beliefs. Many beliefs develop gradually as attempts to make sense of painful experiences. Number 5, we have emotion. Beliefs influence emotions. If, for example, I believe I cannot depend on anyone, I may frequently feel anxious when I need help. If I believe I'm unwanted, I may become especially sensitive to rejection or anything that appears to be rejection. The emotion is often connected to the belief. Next, we go on to protective strategy, which is our 6th concept on this framework. Here's where behavior begins to make sense. Protective strategies are the ways we try to keep ourselves emotionally safe. Zenra, for example, protects herself through her hyper-independence. She solves problems alone. She avoids vulnerability. She tells herself, I've got this. I always got this. Arahaz, on the other hand, protects himself differently. Whenever he begins feeling unwanted or not needed, he distances himself. Leaving feels safer than risking deeper rejection. Neither person is trying to create problems in this relationship. Each is simply trying to avoid emotional pain. We then move on to the next concept, which is behavior. Eventually, those protective strategies become visible behaviors. And that is what most people see. People don't see the wound, they see the behavior. They may say, she's distant, or he's withdrawn, or she's overly controlling, or he's avoidant. But behavior is often the last chapter of a much longer story. We move on to number 8, the relationship pattern. Now, when two people's protective strategies interact, patterns begin developing. Zenra becomes more independent, Arahaz feels more unwanted, Arahaz distances himself, Zenra relies on herself even more and more. Neither person is responding only to the present moments that they're having, present issues that they're having in the moment. They're both responding to emotional histories they may not even realize they carry. Number 9 is identity. So over time, these behaviors become habits and patterns, of course, but habits eventually become identities. Zenra may begin saying, I'm just an independent person. I don't like depending or relying on anyone. Arahaz may begin saying, I'm just someone who leaves when relationships stop feeling safe. The minute I feel unwanted or unneeded, I'm out. Eventually, we stop seeing our protective strategies as something we learned. We begin believing this is just who I am. We take on that identity of a protective strategy. Lastly, number 10, and this is where hope begins. Healing through understanding, number 10. So we realize that healing doesn't begin with shame. Healing doesn't begin with judgment. And it simply begins with understanding. When we understand the experiences, the meanings, the wounds, the beliefs, and the protective strategies, we begin seeing ourselves and others with compassion instead of condemnation. We stop asking, what's wrong with me? Or what's wrong with him? Or what's wrong with her? Instead, we ask, what happened to me? And perhaps even more importantly, what did that experience teach me about myself? That question has the power to change, I want to say to change everything. In closing, episode 1, this framework is not about blaming our past or blaming our parents or anybody for that matter. It's really about understanding ourselves and others. Because when behavior finally begins to make sense, healing becomes possible. In our next episode, episode 2, we'll take a closer look at how emotional wounds are formed and why the same experience can leave two people with very different emotional stories. I have had an amazing time sharing with you this episode, sharing the framework. And in conclusion, remember, behavior is often the language of a wound. Every wound has a story. Every story deserves to be heard. So until next time, listen with compassion, respond with wisdom, and choose healing. I am Dr. Caroline Kristo, And thank you for joining me on When the Wounds Speak.